Professor Dershowitz will be interviewed by Hadley Heath Manning, Policy Director for Independent Women's Forum, and Tony Blankley, Senior Fellow with the Steamboat Institute. Let's give a warm Steamboat Springs welcome to Professor Alan Dershowitz and Hadley Heath Manning.
I've been talking a lot with my Uber drivers today. I spoke with another Uber driver and I told him, tonight I'm interviewing Alan Dershowitz. And the Uber driver said to me, he said, yeah, I've got mixed feelings about him.
That's better than I usually get.
Yeah?
Mixed is okay.
Mixed is okay. You know what my answer to him, Professor, was? Yeah, we all do. Such is the life of one Professor Alan Dershowitz. But so I guess my first question for you then is, because you may not fit the mold of the political persuasion of this audience, what's a nice liberal guy like you doing at a conference like this?
Well, thank you. First of all, I love the Steamboat Institute. You guys represent the best of seeking liberty and freedom and due process and freedom of speech. And today, I find, as a classic liberal, I find today I have much more in common with classic conservatives than I do with hard left, newly woke people. We share a common commitment to principled dialogue, to principled decision-making, to the protection of views that we disagree with, to due process for those we disagree with. And if you go on a college campus today, you hear the newly woke students saying, due process? We know who's guilty. If you're a privileged white male, you're guilty. If you're an unprivileged minority, you're not guilty. What do we need due process for? What do we need hearings for? We know who's guilty and who's innocent. Why do we need free speech? We know the truth with a capital T. And when we hear opposing points of view, it scares us. It makes us feel unsafe. And unsafe has become the new trigger for censorship. I have to tell you, when a college student looks me in the eye and says, I don't feel unsafe, I don't believe them. I think they're lying. I hate to call students liars, but when they use the term unsafe, they're lying. When they say that they can't be safe with Ron Sullivan, an African-American professor at Harvard, the dean of Winthrop House, because he's representing somebody in court they disagree with, I don't believe them. And if they're telling the truth, if they really feel unsafe in the presence of a law professor, they don't belong at a university. No student should feel safe about their ideas. Every student should feel safe about their personal physical security. But safe about ideas, that's exactly what a university is not supposed to be like. So I'm here because I disagree with you on some issues. I am a liberal. You are mostly conservatives. We may have differences on gay marriage, a woman's right to choose, issues of even taxation, which is one of your major issues. We can continue to debate and dialogue about those issues. But the key issues of can we continue to debate, which is free speech, and can we continue to have a process for making sure we don't go against the wrong people, I think we're in fundamental agreement about those issues. And thank you for inviting me.
Since you've touched on a couple of issues like due process and defending clients that might not be so popular or might be unlikable or controversial, there's
that's a minor way of putting it.
We could talk about some of the clients that you've defended, and you can sort of, there's the ugly laundry list of names from Klaus von Bülow to O.J. Simpson to Mike Tyson and Jeffrey Epstein. And so I want to know, first and foremost, what is your moral reasoning behind taking the cases of these clients?
Okay, that's a great question. And part of the reason I take the most controversial cases and the cases of the most hated people in this country is because I was a law professor with tenure, which meant I had no excuse for not defending the most despised people. I couldn't say, oh, I worry about my job. By the way, today, I'm not sure tenure will protect you against defending some of the most despised people in the world. But if the most despised people don't get a defense, you know, it moves on to everybody. H.L. Mencken once said that the reason we have to defend the civil liberties of the world's worst SOBs is because the way the government works is first they make bad laws and apply them to the worst people. Once they have that precedent established, they then apply them to the rest of us. And so, look, I'm a criminal defense lawyer. Let me make an admission here tonight. The vast majority of my clients have been guilty. Thank God for that. Would anyone want to live in a country where the vast majority of people accused of crime are innocent? That's Iran. That's China. That's Russia. That's Venezuela. That's Cuba. That's not the United States of America. Thank God we have a system that only tries to go after the guilty. And why does that system still work? Because criminal defense lawyers don't make it easy for prosecutors. We press them. We attack them. We challenge them. We tell them that unless you have the goods, we're going to beat you. And that way, they only go after people who they believe are guilty. If we let up for a moment, if lawyers wouldn't represent the rogues gallery of people that you've told me about, and I don't like most of my clients, I have to tell you that. But if I didn't represent people like that, first of all, I couldn't teach my students to do it. You know, people say, oh, they deserve a representation, but they don't deserve you. No, they deserve me, because I was a tenured professor and I was teaching legal ethics for 40 years. And if I didn't defend those people, then the government would start going after people who are very marginal. You know, people say that a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged. Okay. I understand that.
By reality.
But a civil libertarian is a conservative whose kid's been busted for pot, whose father-in-law has been arrested for insider trading. You know, once a loved one is indicted or arrested, suddenly you fall in love with criminal defense attorneys. And I hope none of you fall in love with me, because I don't want to have to represent any of you. But if your children, grandchildren, nieces, and nephews need a lawyer, Carolyn knows, my wife knows, I'm there 24 hours a day. We have people on Martha's Vineyard who have called me in the middle of the night because their kid has been busted, or drunken driving, or expelled from school. And I defend them all pro bono. And I do a pretty good job. But once I was perceived as in any way supporting President Trump, this same group of people whose kids I have saved, whose kids I have helped, stopped talking to me. Not only stopped talking to me, but said to people they needed trigger warnings. They want to know before they come to an event, is Dershowitz going to be there? If he is, we're not coming. It's okay if my wife's there. But if I'm going to be there, they want to know in advance, and they don't want to come. The hypocrisy, the unbelievable hypocrisy that operates is beyond belief. But I'm going to continue to represent people you hate and people I hate. And I think of myself in some ways, the analogy isn't perfect, as a doctor in the emergency room. My daughter-in-law is an emergency room doctor. My son was a legal aid lawyer, and remarkably, once in the same week, they had the same patient client, and it was Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson was wheeled into the emergency ward, having just had an accident in his car. My daughter-in-law took care of him, and then a short time later, my son was part of our defense team for Mike Tyson. So you never know who's going to be wheeled into the emergency room, whose kid is going to get busted in the middle of the night, and we never want to see a system. You know, I worked in the Soviet Union for many years. I was talking to Mr. Shapiro before, who's from the Soviet Union. I was there in the 70s. In the Soviet Union, if you were charged with a crime against the state, you could not get a lawyer. We figured out a terrific technique. I was representing refuseniks, people who were trying to get out of the country and they wouldn't let them out. So what we finally did is we signed up a bunch of Jewish lawyers to be our co-counsel, and the next day they all got exit visas. So people were saying, you want to get out of the Soviet Union? Join Dershowitz's defense team. And we got a whole bunch of people out that way.
And you know, you mentioned President Trump. I want to talk about Trump. We're going to talk about the Mueller report. We're going to talk about impeachment.
Sure.
But while we're on the topic of due process, and I think you'll find a room full of people here at the Steamboat Institute who value due process and the presumption of innocence. But I want to ask you about the Me Too movement, because this is something that has affected at least our cultural perceptions of the presumption of innocence. The Kavanaugh hearing, certainly a big part of that. And before I do that, Professor, I have to ask you about the accusation that's been leveled against you.
I am a victim of the Me Too movement.
Well, Virginia Roberts has named many powerful men as people that she says she was directed to have sex with by Jeffrey Epstein. What do you say to this?
Well, I never met the woman. I never heard of her. I never met her. And we got some emails recently that were sealed. They tried to seal it. They first tried to deep six it. We subpoenaed the emails. The lawyers for her said they didn't have any, but we finally got them. And in the emails, she admits that in 2011, which is 9 years after she claimed she had sex with me 7 different times, in places I never was at, islands, ranches, airplanes, in front of my own house, she said I had sex with her. And then she came into my house. At the time, I had a young daughter. We had video surveillance. In any event, she said she had sex with me in 2002. Then in 2011, she writes an email proving she never heard of me. She has to be told, oh, Dershowitz, he's the guy who represented Klaus von Bülow. He's famous. You should put him in your book. This is all in emails. You should put him in your book because he will help you sell the book. So then she puts me in the book as someone she did not have sex with. She said she had sex with Professor Steve. She said she had sex with Leslie Wexner. She said she had sex with George Mitchell. She said she had sex with Bill Richardson. She said she had sex with you name it. But she said she did not have sex with me. She once met me with Jeffrey Epstein. Then, when she meets her lawyers a few years later, suddenly she remembers. She gets woke. She remembers, oh, yeah, that guy I never heard of, I had sex with him 7 times. And how anybody could believe this is remarkable to me. So I hired the former head of the FBI, Louis Freeh, who was a former federal judge, and I said, here, you do this. I'm not going to even talk to you. I'm not going to be involved with you. Here are all my travel records. You do an investigation. He did an investigation. He said there was absolutely no truth to the charges. I was never on the places she said she was. I have all my travel records to prove it. What is her background? Her background is she gets paid $160,000 by the Daily Mail in order to lie about who she met on Jeffrey Epstein's island. So she said she met Tipper Gore and Al Gore on Jeffrey Epstein's island. There's only one problem. Neither of them ever met Jeffrey Epstein. They were never on the island, and Secret Service records prove it. They say, and here some of you will probably have some skepticism, she said in the same article that she had twice dinner with Bill Clinton in the presence of 2 underage girls, and Bill Clinton had been flown to the island in a black helicopter with Secret Service agents, piloted by a woman who had just gotten her license, her pilot's license. So we, of course, filed FOIA requests, Freedom of Information requests, and they proved he had never been on the island. He had been on his airplane, but never been on the island. So on the one hand, you have the word of a serial liar with no evidence, no proof, no witnesses. On the other side, you have overwhelming evidence of innocence that I never met her, and yet you go on Twitter, and I'm a pedophile, I'm a child rapist, I'm you name it, and you can't get the media to tell this story. When I got these emails, I thought, oh my God, for sure, everybody would want to write the story. This is a woman who's been proved to be a liar. I could not get anybody in the media to write the story. I hope maybe some of you are out there from the media. You would be interested in writing the story. I'd be happy to cooperate with you. But people asked me today on CNN, how will I get my name cleared? I said, my name's been cleared. I don't have to clear my name. I've proved my innocence beyond any doubt. She has no proof of my guilt. Why is anybody believing her? The burden now is on the people to explain why they don't look at the evidence. But we live in a world where evidence no longer matters. We live in a post-truth world where identity politics prevails over everything else. And I'm going to fight that in my own case. I'm going to fight it in anybody else's case. The Me Too movement is great. It's wonderful. They have made people responsible for acts they've done in the past. By the way, in every Me Too case, the accuser and the accused knew each other. There was a relationship. Was it a consensual? Was it non-consensual? There was always a relationship. Mine is the only case where there is no evidence, because it didn't happen, that I ever met this woman or saw her or she ever saw me. So it's a remarkable case because it's totally black and white.
Why do you think that she's accusing you versus some of, the President Trump or Bill Clinton, some of these others that she no longer says any wrongdoing?
She told her best friend that, and we have it on tape. She told her best friend that she accused me because her lawyers pressured her into it, because here was the plot. There's a very wealthy man. He owns Victoria's Secret. His name is Leslie Wexner. Lives in Columbus, near Columbus, Ohio. So the plan was a very simple plan. Name Dershowitz in public, then go, lawyers, privately, secretly to Wexner and say to Wexner, you saw what happened to Dershowitz? You want that to happen to you? There are ways of resolving this. And that's what happened. We have the chronology, we have the dates, we have the time. We know that her lawyer went to speak to Wexner's lawyer. Wexner's lawyer used the word shakedown when he spoke to me about it. Wexner's wife used the word shakedown. So I was the perfect stalking horse for an extortion plot. As soon as this happened, I took the case to the U.S. Attorney's Office. I took the case to the District Attorney's Office, and I said, I want you to investigate me, and I want you to investigate the lawyers, and I want you to investigate my accusers. And I hope they do.
Thanks for answering those questions.
Thank you. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to set the record straight.
I'm going to do a hard pivot and talk a little bit about President Trump and specifically the Mueller report.
Right.
What do you think the long-term legacy of the Mueller report
Well,
will
I
be?
hope the long-term legacy of the Mueller report is that we will never, ever again have a special counsel or a special prosecutor appointed. That institution is a disaster to the Constitution. It takes somebody and says, you have a target. Prosecutors don't have targets. Prosecutors work. They're civil servants. If there's crimes, they find them. If there isn't, they go back and look for others. But prosecutors generally aren't given targets. And when you're a special counsel or a special prosecutor, you're told your job is to be Captain Ahab and the whale is your target. And you better come back with a harpoon in that whale. Otherwise, you've failed for your job. And it just doesn't fit into our system of democracy, our system of checks and balances. So I hope the long-term legacy will be that we will no longer have special counsel. There should be a special unit of the Justice Department which consists of pure civil servants, non-politically appointed people whose job it is to investigate any government corruption, any allegations about government officials, but they should be normal prosecutors in the normal course of events. Take, for example, the Inspector General. We're expecting his report any day. I will be doing an introduction to that report as well, and I hope it will be as widely read as the Mueller report, because I think it will focus a lot on what led to the problems of the Mueller report. We'll see what happened with the various dossiers, with the request to the FOIA court, to the court, the intelligence court, whether they had the appropriate basis. We'll find out a lot more about that. But who is the Inspector General? He is a career civil servant who is trusted and has integrity. And all we need is a group of Inspector Generals like that who can do that job.
Excellent. One of the things you mentioned was checks and balances. I guess one check and balance might be considered impeachment, which is something that a lot of Democrats, some Democrats, show interest in. What's your perspective on impeachment? What's the case for it, and what's the case against it?
Okay, so you'll be very surprised when I tell you this. I started to write my book, The Case Against Impeaching Trump. I started to write it in 2016, before anybody was elected. And here's the original title of the book, The Case Against Impeaching Hillary Clinton. Because you'll remember that in the run-up to the 2016 election, some Republicans were yelling, "Lock her up." Some were saying, on the day she assumes office, we'll start impeachment proceedings. Remember, many people thought that Hillary Clinton would be elected. So I started to write my book because I have taught about impeachment. I've studied impeachment. I've read the history of impeachment. I've read the debates about impeachment in the congressional debates that occurred. And I think I'm an expert on the law of impeachment. And I wouldn't write a different book no matter who the president was. So when President Trump got elected, I voted for Hillary Clinton. I wanted her to win. I campaigned for her. I contributed to her. When Donald Trump won and they started proceedings to impeach him, I took the book and I just changed the word Clinton to Trump. The arguments were the same. In order to impeach under our Constitution, remember at the Constitutional Convention, there was a great debate about impeachment. And I'm not going to bore you with the details or the names of the people, but a number of the people said, let's have the power of Congress to impeach for maladministration of office. There was a debate, and it was rejected overwhelmingly because that would give Congress too much power over the president. And instead, they set out the specific criteria, two specifically named crimes: treason, which is defined in the Constitution, bribery, which was not defined in the Constitution, but everybody pretty much knew what it meant, or, and then listen to the word or, that's very important, other high crimes and misdemeanors. So it either has to be bribery, treason, or crimes and misdemeanors. Now, what did misdemeanors mean? At the time of the framing, a misdemeanor was a crime that affected governance, that involved governance. So it couldn't just be an ordinary crime. That's why I think Bill Clinton was improperly impeached. He committed a crime, but it was a low crime, not a high crime. Having sex in the Oval Office and lying about it was not a high crime. A high crime, and let me give you some background on a high crime, because there's some terrific history on this. Alexander Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury. Talk about low crimes. A woman comes over to him and seduces him. She's a married woman. He's a married man. They have an affair. And then it turns out that it was all an extortion plot. The husband had sent the wife to seduce him. The husband then goes to Alexander Hamilton and says, unless you pay me a fortune of money in those days, several $1,000s, I will expose you. So Hamilton pays him the money. Then he comes back and he says, unless you give me more money, I will say that the money you paid came from Treasury funds. A light goes off in Hamilton's head. He wrote the Federalist paper on impeachment. He knows what he's talking about. He says, oh my God, if they accuse me of taking money from the Treasury, that's a high crime. If they accuse me merely of adultery, which was, by the way, a felony, a serious felony at common law, if they accuse me just of adultery, that's a low crime. So he does something that was very dramatic and courageous. He writes an essay and publishes it all over the country admitting his adultery. His wife was furious, you can imagine. He admits that he paid the money, but he proves that it didn't come from Treasury funds, and he's not impeached. He remains in office. That's very, very evidentiary of what the framers had in mind. And of course, President Trump hasn't even come close to committing anything which would be an impeachable offense. And so I'm not going to remain silent in the face of that. All of my liberal friends on Martha's Vineyard, some of them say to me, look, you're right, but why can't you just shut up? Why do you have to be helping this guy? And I said, I was born with my mouth open. I don't know how to shut up. My mother taught me, always act on principle, always be consistent. My wife demands that I be principled and consistent. And I have one test for consistency. And you all know it. It's the shoe on the other foot test. And that is, if the facts were the opposite, if the party was the opposite, would you still be making that argument? And I made it against conservatives in my book, Supreme Injustice, when I argued that I did not think that Justice Scalia, who is a close personal friend who I love personally, I did not think Justice Scalia would necessarily have stopped the voting in Florida if it had been Gore versus Bush rather than Bush versus Gore. And I have to tell you, Scalia was furious at me when I wrote that argument. But I said I just didn't subjectively believe it. And he and I continued to fight about this repeatedly. We were in Israel together. We had debates. And then just 2 months before he died, this is a poignant story, I was with him. I have a photograph of that day. And he says to me, Alan, before both of us get senile, I'm going to tell you why I voted that way back then, and you will be surprised. End of the story. I never found out. But he wrote me a long letter in which he explained at least some of his vote. Look, you can agree or disagree with Scalia's decision. You can agree or disagree with me. But I think you won't disagree with the shoe on the other foot test. That's the test of principle. The test has to be the same, whether it's being applied to a Democrat or Republican, a conservative, a liberal, black, white, male, female. There has to be the same principle test. And I will always stand by those tests. So I have 2 more things to show you. Number one, my publisher also came out with another cover for my book. Once I wrote the book, The Case Against Impeaching Trump, we needed a second cover. This is the plain brown wrapper that some of you may remember when you were kids and you had a book like the Amboy Dukes or some other dirty book. You put a plain brown wrapper around it so your mommy and daddy wouldn't learn what you were reading. So we produced this cover for the Martha's Vineyard audience so people could read my book without being shunned and shamed. I just have one more thing to show you. My wonderful wife, because we've been so criticized on Martha's Vineyard, people ask me all the time, how could you say anything that helps Donald Trump? And my wife got me a shirt that I now wear all the time on Martha's Vineyard, and it says, "It's the Constitution, stupid." And if they don't understand that, it's hopeless.
I like the shoe on the other foot test. I like talking about Democrats and Republicans. I do some of that in my work. So let's talk a little bit about Democrats and Republicans.
Sure.
As a civil libertarian, how do you rate the parties today? You said you voted for Hillary Clinton. Are you watching with interest the Democratic debates presently? And how would you rate some of their candidates on issues that you care most about?
Well, of course, I'm watching very carefully. I know several of the candidates personally. I know Donald Trump personally. I knew some of the Republicans. Ted Cruz was my student. So, you know, at my age, I know a lot of people in politics. On both sides of the aisle, I'm very worried about the Democratic Party as a Democrat. I'm very worried that it's becoming captive of some people on the extreme hard left. And I never want to see the Republicans and the Democrats so far apart that they can't talk to each other. I spent, some of you may remember this, back in the 70s, I was a constant guest on Bill Buckley's TV show. And Bill called me his favorite liberal. I called him my favorite conservative. We could talk about anything. We could talk about anything. We never raised our voices. We never got excited. We never called each other names. And we would finish the show and go out and have, you know, a beer. That's not happening anymore, unfortunately. And so I worry that the Democratic Party, as evidenced by the election of the 4 new members of Congress who call themselves the Squad, are presenting a new face on American politics. And it's an extremely dangerous one. And it's one, of course, that President Trump is going to try to take maximum advantage of. And the Democrats are playing into his hands. Take this issue of the State of Israel, an independent sovereign ally of the United States, refusing entry to 2 members of Congress who have sworn to destroy the State of Israel. They don't want Israel to exist. They want there to be a Palestinian state from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Does any country allow people to come in who call for its destruction? Today there's a memo issued by the Israeli government showing the close connections between the BDS tactic and terrorism. And the people that sponsored the group, this too, remember a group of Republicans and Democrats were in Israel. They could have joined that group. But they didn't. They decided to go on their own, not to visit Israel, just to go to the Palestinian Authority. And they were sponsored by a group that had engaged in Holocaust denial, had engaged in blood libels, had engaged in overt anti-Semitism. And the Israeli government finally decided they didn't want to do it. They were encouraged by President Trump not to do it. If Prime Minister Netanyahu had called me, I'm his friend, I've known him since he's 22 years old, I would have told him the following. I would have said, you have the absolute right to bar them. You have the absolute right, legally and morally and diplomatically. But it would be much smarter if you told them the following. Look, we invite people of every persuasion to come to visit in Israel, but we have a tradition. When you come to Israel, you visit 3 places. First, you go to Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Memorial, and you show your respect for the 6 million Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust. You go there first. And these members of Congress would not have done that, and then Israel would have won the public relations war. He also should have told them to go to Sderot, where you see rockets coming every day from Gaza, and to go to the Golan Heights, where you will see why President Trump was absolutely correct in recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. I advised President Trump to do that, and I gave him an example, which he used. I said, has any country ever returned a battleship that was captured in a defensive war? The Golan Heights is a battleship. It is a place from which rockets were fired at Israeli civilians down in the valley. You don't give back a battleship. And he used that analogy. I also urged him to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And I was invited to be there when that event occurred. I took my grandson, and we had a wonderful, memorable time when the United States finally, too late, but finally recognized the reality that Jerusalem is Israel's capital. So I think that principle is important. And I believe that bipartisanship requires 2 things. It requires that you condemn the person you voted for if they do wrong. And I condemned President Obama mercilessly when he allowed his representative to the UN not to veto a resolution that declared the Western Wall to be occupied territory, Hebrew University, and the Hadassah Hospital access roads to be occupied territory, and the Jewish Quarter, which has been inhabited by Jews for 3,000 years, to be occupied territory. I railed against him. It ended our relationship, our personal relationship. But I will continue to attack people I voted for when they're wrong. And I will commend people I voted against when they're right. And I did that with President Trump over the Golan Heights, and over Jerusalem, and over a number of other issues. I will continue to criticize him when I think he's wrong.
And we've talked about Israel a lot. You have a new book, Defending Israel.
Well, it has a subtitle, Defending Israel, the story of my relationship with my most challenging client. That was before Epstein. So maybe I'll say my second most challenging client.
Don't need to get a new book cover for that one, right? Okay, we've got some audience questions that I have on your card, so thank you for those of you who've given us some audience questions. Here's a question. Are there too many laws?
Oh, that's a great question. And the answer, I'm going to be so clear and so unequivocal. The question is, are there too many laws? And the answer is clear. Yes and no. Let me explain why. There are far too many regulatory laws. There are far too many intrusions on the freedom of business people, the freedom of ordinary people to go around doing their lives. The tradition in America has always been, if it's not specifically illegal, you're permitted to do it. In totalitarian countries, it's unless it's specifically allowed, you're not allowed to do it. And so liberty requires fewer regulatory laws. But when it comes to criminal laws, I think we need very specific criminal laws. I don't like general laws that prohibit fraud, that prohibit other kinds of generalizations that don't define what they are. If you want to prohibit particular activities, you should have specific statutes prohibiting each of those activities, and don't leave it to the discretion of prosecutors to determine what constitutes fraud, what does not constitute fraud, or leave it to the jury. So I think the answer is yes and no.
This next question I find interesting. Looks like someone in the Steamboat audience doesn't have a very positive opinion of President Trump, so that's right. We have a lot of diversity of thought here. Sure. The way this person phrased the question was, President Trump, overall negative for our country or overall negative for our country? And if I can put my own spin on the question, because I appreciate what you're saying about bipartisanship, my question on top of this question about whether or not President Trump's an overall negative for the country is, what do you think that we as conservatives can do to better condemn the things on our side of the aisle that we ought to condemn and commend on maybe your side of the aisle?
That's a great, great question. Look, I gave President Trump advice at one point when he invited me to dinner. He didn't follow it. I said, well, he followed some of it. This was during the Muller. I said, don't testify, don't pardon anybody now, don't fire anybody, and don't tweet. Well, you can see that he followed some and not others. I also said, don't divide family at the borders. And by the way, we had a very interesting conversation about that, and a conversation on television as well, because I got on television. And I said to the president directly, as you can talk to the president sometimes through Fox News, I said, you're the Article 2, you're the president. You have great authority under Article 2, and you have the power to order that families not be separated. And I have to tell you, a couple of days later, he did issue that statement. I don't think he did it because I said so, but because the American public was giving him a message. They didn't want that. Look, I disagree with his policy on immigration. I think we have to have restricted immigration. I agree with that. I think we have to be very tough on immigration, but I think we have to be open to legal immigration without preferring certain groups of people from certain countries to other groups of people. We all loved singing God Bless America. It's one of my favorite songs. It was written by an immigrant named Irving Berlin, who came to America from what some people might call an SH-blank-T country. He came from a country in Eastern Europe that didn't have the sophistication that the United States had. We're a country of immigrants. And if you look every year, they have a list of what immigrants have contributed to America. And they're not only immigrants from Norway. They are immigrants from all over the world, including Asia and Africa. And we have to have a non-racist, certainly not everybody would agree with that, policy on immigration. Look, we had racist policies on immigrations until 1925 even, when we had restrictive entry. We had restrictions on who could come from Asia. We had restrictions who could come from South Europe. And some of the greatest people who have contributed to America have been immigrants. So I respectfully disagree with the president's policies, though I agree that we need good border control and we have to stop illegal immigration. Illegal immigration is unfair to legal immigrants, and that's very important. Yeah.
Okay, we talked a little bit about the impeachment of President Clinton, so this question relates to that. It says, why was President Clinton not prosecuted for perjury when he lied under oath about his adultery?
Well, first, I was part of his defense team. So I'm going to give you a more defense-oriented perspective. He was, as you know, disbarred or suspended from the bar because of his alleged perjury. There were some questions about the technicalities as to whether the crime of perjury had been established. He could have been prosecuted after he left office. You can't be prosecuted while you're in office, I believe, for crimes committed while you're in office, and I think that's a good rule for America. I also think it would be a good rule that you couldn't be sued while you're in office. You have to postpone the time of the lawsuit. The statute of limitations should be postponed. But look, I want to decriminalize. I want to de-weaponize the criminal justice system. I wrote another book before this called Trumped Up about how the criminal justice system is being used by both sides to try to use it against one's political opponents. You know, there was a South American dictator once who said, "For my friends, everything. For my enemies, the law." And I don't want to see us turn into a banana republic where we prosecute people after they've been defeated for office. Being defeated for office is enough, and it preserves a democracy. So.
Thank you. I think maybe we have time for one last question. This is a simple yes or no question.
There's no such thing. Yeah. Oh, the question is, did O.J. do it?
Simple yes or no.
The answer is yes, I can't tell you.
Yes, I can't tell you.
But I'll tell you a funny story about it. So my wife and I were in Israel writing a book I wrote about the Bible called The Genesis of Justice. We were there with our daughter, and Bibi gets elected. I knew him since he's 22. He calls us. He says, you know, come to my office Friday afternoon when everything's closed. We'll take a few pictures, we'll schmooze. And so we do. And we get there, and it's all fun. And then he says, Alan, I need you to come into the private area that is the most protected from any possible intrusion or overhearing. So I thought for sure he was going to ask me about Iran or the Palestinians. And he says, Alan, did O.J. do it? So I said, Mr. Prime Minister, there's a question I've always wanted to ask you. Does Israel have nuclear weapons? He said, you know, Alan, I can't tell you that. I said, Mr. Prime Minister, you know I can't tell you that. I just want to show you one more thing that we have in common. You know, people say sometimes when young people appear, like the people from this wonderful fellowship who are such fantastic future and really current leaders, old people like me often say, oh, these people are so young, I have ties older than that. Okay, so I'm wearing a tie now, which has on it the Bill of Rights. This tie I bought at the bicentennial celebration of America, which is 43 years ago. It's out of style because it's very wide, but I have to tell you, ties can go out of style. The Bill of Rights will never go out of style.
Alan
Thank you.
Dershowitz.
Thank you.
Oh,
That was
thank you.
great. Great questions. Thank you all so much.